Greetings! Welcome to Contentious Issues in Theoretical Neuroscience. I am your presenter, Dr. Paul Karitsis, and today I will be dissecting and critically examining one of the greatest philosophical conundrums of our time. Does free will, conation, volition, call it what you will, exist in any objective sense? Greetings and welcome to Contentious Issues in Theoretical Neuroscience. I'm your presenter, Dr. Paul Karitsis, and today's feature will be about whether free will exists in any objective sense. Exciting, right? I will begin by placing the topic within a historical context. I will then introduce a small-scale perspective, specifically that of the theoretical and experimental neurosciences, and this will include but will not be limited to lesion studies, brain pathology, as well as the very compelling and exciting experiments of the neuroscientist Dr. Benjamin Libet. And then I will conclude the presentation by shifting gears and describing the determinism, non-determinism debate from within the lens of mind-matter interaction, and specifically an anomalous phenomenon known as precognitive dreams, which happens to be an area that I've written and published on extensively. I hope you enjoy the presentation. For time immemorial, the more inquisitive among us have spent innumerable hours thinking about our place in the cosmos and whether we can act independently of the universal forces which mutually interpenetrate us, transform us, compete for our undivided attention, and at times compel us to investigate and quest for mastery over something. Is the trajectory of life, the integrated and unitary flavor of conscious mental experience, under our volitional control? Or is volition, whatever that may be, of unconscious origin? Are goal-directed actions which spontaneously arise from the froth of each contemplative mind predetermined or not? Are we masters of our own destiny? Or is that whole idea an epiphenomenon of wishful thinking, fabricated at the behest of an over-evolved brain wishing to present the self in the best possible light? It's an elusive interdisciplinary question, transcending time and sociocultural milieu, the million-dollar question that has had some of the most sagacious minds scratching their heads. Traditionally, the contentious issue has been the prerogative of philosophy. However, contemporaneous theoretical developments in the cognitive and affective neurosciences have rendered it a respectable candidate for investigation using the idiosyncratic methodologies of those specific disciplines. Obviously, our position on the topic, our personal belief about it, is deeply colored by the philosophical framework we subscribe to. The deterministic position, a fixed belief that we meander about the interactive chessboard of life, aided by a blind knee-jerk reaction to environmental stresses and stimuli, and without any imaginative powers of our own, or creative powers of our own, reflects a more reductionistic evaluation of the human condition. Alternatively, philosophical narratives preserving human giftedness and exalting seemingly kind of superhuman acts of ingenuity and dominance over nature tend to espouse more nuanced, non-deterministic perspectives. This appears to be the general lay of the land, but there's always exceptions. So the conclusions we draw about free will depend on how we define or operationalize the term, so it's partly a question of semantics. At first blush, the two opposed philosophical schools, the notion of fate and the notion of free will, appear diametrically opposed. Fate is a conviction that events of our lives are predetermined. We are colourful puppets which extracerebral and sometimes intracerebral puppeteers manipulate, manage, and maneuver without our choosing. These percipients are at the mercy of extraordinary forces, never quite knowing if or when they might be emancipated from their stranglehold. Fate, it seems, is all about these sobering climaxes and conclusions. Nonetheless, its dreaded ability to conjure and facilitate collective feelings of disempowerment have clearly not dampened its popularity. For many, the whole idea of displacing accountability to external forces and saying something to the effect of, I had no control over what I was doing because powerful unconscious drives were hard at work on me, the idea of being absolved of personal responsibility after having committed a dubious, a selfish, an irrational, or an unethical act is an extremely seductive prospect, making determinism a most attractive epistemic position. So as we know, humans can be quite fickle, they can be self-serving, and they can be lazy, with a vast majority electing for the path of least resistance. Following that path may also mean we're willing to allow responsibility for our own questionable choices to fall on sturdier shoulders. And what we see in the illustration is a woman standing at the beginning of what appears to be a life trajectory. So this illustration obviously represents fate or determinism. The start point is obviously birth, and then the finish point up at the top represents or connotes death. Her life trajectory is obviously punctuated by certain life events, predetermined life events that can be noted. And we also see a shadow in the form of Superwoman, which might represent her higher self. Now that we've looked at fate or determinism, let's look at non-determinism or free will. So free will, it's an idea that living organisms equipped with some kind of metaphorical mind space can formulate, coordinate, and execute goal-directed actions within an environmental niche. So these actions usually reflect explicit consequences over chance expectation. We posit that at some stage during our evolutionary history, there were permanent increases in neural complexity, which created a functionally self-organizing neocortex, right? A very complex brain able to support processing systems with emergent properties. So alongside this new cerebral hardware came what we call subjective mental experience, an inner world, a curious phenomenon void of scientific objectivity, but nevertheless able to surmount the substrate of quantum indeterminacies and modulate movement of energy and information across time. So some would call this quote-unquote mind and information exchange or interaction between these minds a group mind. Such a robust countercurrent to entropy meant that we, the human species, could now nurse our way through quantum states and disorder by manipulating interaction patterns and external affairs according to our acquired cognitive affective programs and the like. So in fact, some would argue maintaining microscale informational flow through the systematic selection or rejection of quantum states and hence homeostatic balance in a chaotic environment is an expression of quote-unquote will. So the will to exist, the will to live, the will to survive, So you might want to think of free will as the ability to pedal upstream or perhaps free oneself from a gravitational pull or an orbit. And that's the concept that's being represented in this specific illustration which you see. I'm going to begin by placing determinism and non-determinism within a historical context. The historical courses of fate and free will began millennia ago, inextricably linked with revelatory components of early religious and spiritual life. These deterministic perspectives of the cosmos were propagated by the priesthood cross-culturally. Looking to the cupola of the sky, these meticulous star watchers surmised that temporal cycles of birth, death, and rebirth pervading the celestial bodies must also apply to the corporeal inhabitants. As above, so below, they reasoned. Predictive astrology begins during this time period as the exclusive domain of these astronomer priests. Their privileged position as harbingers of transdimensional communication was reflected in daily undertakings involving reception of telepathic information from the spirit world through extrasensory perception and the voluntary manifestation of paranormal incidences. Mediumship later flourished within the cultural humus of ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and the Near East until the 4th century, a time of upheaval when the Catholic Church's stringent socio-political and religious reforms first forced them underground. It seems the deterministic philosophy was especially salient in ancient Greek culture, where it appeared under the auspices of oracular divination. The Greek tragedian Aeschylus lucidly describes that as early as 800 BC, brave and inquisitive proselytes undertook pilgrimages to Dodona, an oracular center located in Epirus in northwestern Greece, and engaged in an unbelievable miracle, talking oaks, by which clearly and without riddles you were addressed. At this particular site, mystical messages from talking oaks, sacred to Olympian Zeus, were transliterated into comprehensible terms by priestly interpreters. While the method of mediumship remains unclear, Aeschylus's discourse implicates deception or some kind of voice phenomenon as the most likely possibility. Dodona set the stage for the evolution of the most esteemed and authoritative propaganda machine in the classical world, the Delphic Oracle. Situated on the foot of picturesque Mount Parnassus, near the Castalian Spring, the oracle employed a woman past childbearing age called a Pythia for divine utterance and divination. The Pythia would first cleanse herself of somatic impurities by bathing in the Castalian Spring, before mounting a sacred tripod to channel messages through trance, often in a deep husky voice, as to create the impression that the god Phoebus Apollo was speaking through her. The type of response given was entirely dependent on the generosity of the fee tendered. Stinginess was met with succinct yes or no responses by manner of black or white beans, while more generous amounts inspired more detailed responses through mediumistic trance states. What's so amusing about this entire endeavor is that the nature of one's experience with the Pythia was not independent of their socioeconomic status or the depth of their pockets, a grim reminder to all of those less than desirable and less than philanthropic collective traits which persist through time. Ancient Greek literature is also rife with superstitious deterministic impressions. In Aeschylus's tragedy Agamemnon, Cassandra, the daughter of King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy, was so beautiful that she attracted the interest of polyamorous Apollo. In fact, he was enamored of her at first sight. He showered her with a plethora of gifts, including a natural talent for prophecy. Sadly, her reluctance to reciprocate his affection had dire consequences. The perceived insult roused effusive anger on the god's part, and he proceeded to curse the very gift he had endowed her with. He decreed that Cassandra should retain the gift of foresight, but that each prediction should always be met with ridicule and disbelief. Cassandra accurately predicted the fall of Troy to the Hellenic forces, Agamemnon's death at the hands of his scheming wife Clytemnestra, and the conspiracy to seize the city by means of a hollow wooden horse. Each of her accurate predictions fell on deaf ears. Then there's the Oedipal tragedy, Oedipus the King. Those familiar with Sophocles' renowned play will remember how ill-fated Oedipus unwittingly and unknowingly murdered his father, King Laius of Thebes, and married his mother, Queen Jocasta of Thebes, thus fulfilling the Pythia's blood-curdling prophecy of mating with your own mother and shedding with your own hands the blood of your own sire. For those well versed in the ancient Greek religion, the world of Greek tragedy in which oracular prophecy foretold events coming to be might also be reminiscent of the superintending Moira, or Mira in Greek if you like, three menacing old women draped in spiderwebs who appeared beside children's cribs on the seventh night after their birth to ordain their personal dowry and destiny. The first, Clotho the spinner, wove together the threads of fate. The second, Lachesis the apportioner, deliberated on their chronological span. And the third, Atropos the inevitable, severed the threads with her scissors when the allotted time was up. Belonging to a primordial pagan tradition, these mythological figures survived alongside the Judeo-Christian dichotomy of heaven and hell with its respective beings, the angels and demons, creating a hybrid folkloristic tradition which survived in Greece proper well into the 20th century. So from what I've described in the previous two slides, it seems that paganism and determinism, the idea of an unshakable fate for the human condition, were synonymous. But in 392 BC, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I outlawed paganism. As a result, innumerable temples and centers consecrated to the pagan circle of deities in the Greco-Roman world, so for instance the Isis temple in Philae in Egypt, the Parthenon in Athens, the Delphic oracle in Greece, the temple of Serapis in Alexandria, were forced to cease their age-old ritualistic activities and festivities. By the 4th century, an official edict was issued stipulating that anybody caught practicing sorcery or associating with sorcerers would be put to death. For the Catholic patriarchs and their myopic value system, prophetic, magical, astrological, and alchemical ventures constituted attempts to investigate, question, and understand everything within the cosmos in quantitative terms. Attempts which were quintessentially sacrilegious because they rejected God's notion of blind faith and accepting things as they are on the surface. Under the Christian hegemony, intellectual curiosity was tantamount with sin. No longer compatible with the socio-religious climate propagated by ecclesiastical doctrine, the esoteric practices of pagan determinism went underground, where they remained until the advent of spiritualism in the mid-1800s. As Greek deterministic views of the cosmos flickered out in the Greco-Roman intellectual hubs of Alexandria and Rome, collective non-deterministic views of the human condition were emerging alongside ecclesiastical doctrine, and even because of it. To understand how this came to pass, we must revisit biblical mythology, the principal motivator of socio-political change in the 4th century. According to Genesis and the creation narrative, God, or Elohim, fashioned the cosmos ex nihilo in 6 days. The use of the word Elohim is interesting, for in Hebrew it denotes many, not one. Such mistakes in mythographical translation resulted in enormous socio-political consequences for the disparate cultures these three main monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were to influence. After having called forth a benevolent universe, the Jehovah Elohim of a supplementary creation story separated earth from heaven. He circumscribed the paths of the two great lights, the moon and sun, and he populated the primeval seas and land with living creatures. The prospect of inhabiting a world without any other intellectual creatures wasn't appealing in the least, so God added Adam to his experimentation list and fashioned him according to his own likeness. Eve, on the other hand, was fashioned from Adam's rib and represented a secondary and inferior creation. The latter manifests as an overtly carnal nature which could be led astray. Thus, when Jehovah Elohim placed a supernal garden in Eden and commanded the pair not to eat of the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge standing at its very center, it was Eve, seduced by the devil disguised as a tree serpent, who coerced Adam to submit to this sinful temptation. Their choice to interrogate God's design and look beneath the surface, a wrong choice, resulted in steadfast eviction from Eden. 15 centuries later, the early church fathers extended the Judaic myth by asserting that the awaited Messiah, the mortal incarnation of God the Son promised in the Old Testament, was none other than Jesus of Nazareth. Accordingly, God had to incarnate in the flesh to redeem the fallen descendants of Adam and Eve from their ancestral sin. Through the self-sacrificial act of crucifixion, Jesus of Nazareth would illuminate the salvific path in the context of self-torment, humility, chastity, and an absolute rejection of the part of ourselves that lives and dies like an animal. Christ's passions further irradiated all personal choices that could be made on the earthly plane in a lucid, albeit dichotomous light. One could select to tread along God's path, laid bare by Christ's crucifixion, or alternatively the wicked path of self-destruction and oblivion delineated by the devil. One could choose self-sacrifice, servitude, repentance, and devotion, or alternatively rebellion, unrelenting curiosity, depredation, sodomy, adultery, and murder. Equipped with this learned knowledge of good and evil, each individual is free to choose their destiny. Therefore, the Judeo-Christian traditions contraindicate determinism or fate and implicitly stress that our lives are not predetermined. We arrive at salvation or damnation entirely through our own volition. Before moving into neuroscience and attractor states, I wanted to say that we also see the influence and interplay of certain philosophical schools like determinism and non-determinism in applied disciplines, which stem from philosophy like the theoretical and clinical psychologies. Traditional schools of individual psychotherapy are influenced by a Lockean, Western, scientific tradition that underscores linear cause and effect relationships whereby A causes B, but B has no effect on A. They emphasize determinism, absolutism, and reductionism. Alternatively, the family therapies subscribe to the Kantian tradition and adopt a reciprocal view of causality, where there is a bidirectional flow, so A and B can mutually influence or affect each other. These therapies espouse a relativistic, contextual perspective and are relational, illuminating both the here and now and freedom of choice. So now I'm going to switch gears and try and grasp this contentious debate or issue from a micro scale level. And I'm going to be specifically talking to you about attractor networks or attractor states, a concept in theoretical neuroscience. So what are attractor networks? They're a group of specialized cells which receive information from peripheral sources through their dendrites and then convey this information along their axons to other neuronal groups. Subpopulations of neurons comprising the same attractor network feed back into their own dendritic connections through excitatory collaterals, a phenomenon known as positive feedback looping. As this transpires, inhibitory interneurons are deployed to suppress activities in neighboring neural networks, a complementary phenomenon called negative feedback looping. N-methyl D-aspartic acid, or NMDA, and gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA, receptors mediate this dyadic excitatory inhibitory function, allowing neurons within an attractor network to persist firing at high frequencies long after the application of an external stimulus has been terminated. Under such circumstances, input from dendrites may select neuron subpopulations into stimulus-specific preferential states, and that's the magic word, preferential states, otherwise known as attractor states. So the instantiation of a particular attractor network or a potpourri of stimulus-specific attractor states translates to perceptual awareness of specific sensory information, thoughts, emotions, and memories on the level of lived experience. The probability that a particular attractor network will be activated, reinforced, and enter the perceptual system of an individual as a stable feature depends upon the respective individual's history and the environmental milieu or context. Contingencies of the social environment may permit the emergence of an attractor state, say an evocative memory connected with your beloved grandmother's death, and then reinforce it under recurring conditions, say each time you ponder existential issues such as the meaning of life, so that it becomes a permanent feature of your subjective mental world or experience. Because the emotional valence of an event, meaning making and value systems, and the encoding of explicit memory are all interconnected or deeply connected, it stands to reason that attractor states imbued with higher emotionality are more likely to intrude into conscious awareness than those that aren't. The renowned child psychiatrist Daniel Siegel calls these reinforced patterns of activation states of mind. A phenomenal example of a state of mind could be the remembrance of a shame-filled and excruciating experience in primary school, such as the only time you urinated in your pants. Inaugural aspects of the activation pattern may be underpropped by overpowering visual and somatic information. You may remember the concerned expression on the teacher's face as she led you out of the classroom, or the unusual sensation of proliferating warmth between your legs. As you ponder and probe the memory, other neuronal clusters encoding related olfactory and auditory elements, so elements from the senses of hearing and smell, so the whiff of urine and the laughter of children as you were escorted out of the room, may amalgamate with the existing activation pattern and further augment your dynamic inner experience. Before you know it, the executive and emotional appraisal centers of the brain have delimited you to a related cluster of heterogeneous inner stimuli from an inestimable range of possible neural firings. Neurons that fire together, survive together, and wire together, creating an ingrained configuration of cohesive mind states, a bundle of psychobiological impulses tentatively bound together by habit. The more you brood on and entertain any state of mind, the more deeply ingrained a pathway it becomes. The more you allow these hitherto ingrained states to dominate your conscious awareness, the more predictable your functional interactions with the social environment become. If you persistently deliberate upon precautionary measures you could have taken that may have saved the life of your favorite pet, you will frequently run aground on reefs of despair, hopelessness, and futility, and even become static in life. Similarly, if you continue to combine yellow and green, you'll always get blue, pardon the pun. Specific attractor states will evoke specific emotional and behavioral consequences. While predictability and rigidity is good because it allows for a relatively stable life and the preservation of illusory notions of an immutable self within a space-time continuum, it also diminishes our adaptive sensitivity to an ever-fluctuating world and our creative capacity for random action. The vital lesson here is that one's level of identification with their prevailing attractor states is explicitly correlated with the degree to which their life course may be predetermined. And I underscore that point. An over-identification with prevailing attractor states may breed more immutable trajectories in life, whereas healthy distance or disidentification from them may facilitate more mutable trajectories through the mechanism of proactive choice. As a general rule of thumb, states of mind, or attractor states, bear a striking resemblance to entertainment programs on radio and television. More perceptual airtime generally means more profound and extensive influence on nascent interactions. So, determinism can be scientifically conceptualized through the theory of attractor states. Say at some stage in your life you suffered betrayal at the hands of a long-term partner whom you adored, cherished, and valued. Your love for this individual was such that you could not possibly imagine navigating the valleys and ridges of life without them. Save for the deep emotional pain and wounding that accompanies perceived betrayal, the memory of where you were at, what you were doing, and who you were with at the time would become deeply ingrained in your system. Chances are that you'd re-experience this profile of neural activations many times over in an effort to appraise, rationalize, and comprehend it. In truth, the re-experience may be so persistent that it becomes a near-permanent fixture in your conscious awareness. Being inherently negative, the emotional texture will inspire vast feelings of desolation and hopelessness and initiate a downward spiral into persistent stress, the throes of anxiety and depression. In due course, other phenomenal elements like imagined scenarios of your partner cheating on you or horrendous memories of the time they nearly strangled you might also integrate with the assembling and reassembling neuronal pattern. It would keep growing like a cancerous tumor and may even overwhelm the self-organizational cohesive assets of your mind, brain, body system by reinforcing this mental rigidity and somatic disarray. Without deliberate action on the part of your executive functions to break free of this deleterious cycle, your system would disintegrate into biochemical chaos. So, in retrospect, ceding total power and authority to external contingencies and sitting back for the ride, in a way, could be perceived as invoking one's fate. So, when these attractor states are given too much power, or we brood too much on them and we allow them to grow, they can overwhelm our mental state, right? They can become our mental state and lead us to self-destruction, illness, and so forth. In the illustration which you see, we have what might be described in black as a series of attractor states. So under blue zone, green zone, yellow zone, and red zone, we can, I suppose, conceptualize all those feelings or emotions or sentiments as attractor states as well. So the non-determinism debate has to be couched within scientific law also, the fact that we're not free from certain things. There's genetically programmed differences, for instance, between the sexes, aspects of behavior that are hardwired into our nervous system and not learned from social cues. So if you're a male, for instance, your development will be controlled in part by testosterone, whilst if you're a female, your development will be mediated in part by estrogen and progesterone. These hormones function slightly differently in boys and girls. There's also a disparity between the sexes in the context of sexual development, with girls entering puberty as early as 9 or 10 and boys not moving into this stage until several years afterwards. The sequence and tempo of brain maturation also differs in males and females. So for instance, temporal grey matter, these are areas of the brain which underpin visual and spatial perception and the identification of where objects are in space, appears to develop slightly faster in boys, while parietal grey matter, these are areas of the brain involved in sensory integration, proprioception, which is an awareness of the position and movement of the body, and stereognosis, which is the perception of solid form through touch, develops much faster in girls. In general, the proliferation of grey matter occurs quicker and earlier in girls, suggesting that girls are developmentally ready for the acquisition of certain skills and behaviors way before boys are. And these are general biological rules and trends that we are not exempt from. Information processing also happens to be different, with the connectivity in male brains especially wired for visual, constructional, or visuomotor tasks, while female brains tend to be much better at balancing analytical and intuitive modes of thinking. So there's obvious socio-cultural implications here. There's also certain biological conditions that we are bound by throughout, for the course of our entire lives or the duration of our lives. Inheriting a specific mutation may make you more susceptible to experiencing certain states of consciousness, certain states of emotional hyperarousal, maybe a psychotic process or a dementing disease, providing the pertinent environmental risk factors are also present. So to give you an example, if you carry a specific mutation, so a specific promoter polymorphism of the neuroregulin 1 gene on chromosome 8, it is very possible that you will develop an affinity for creative pursuits and express honorary eminence in creative achievement. But on the downside, you will also be vulnerable to psychosis and schizospectrum disorders, perhaps a lower working memory capacity, a decreased activation of the areas of the brain which underpin cognitive processing, your executive functions, for instance, and perhaps you might also exhibit hypersensitivity to harsh criticism. Inheritance of this gene is something of a double-edged sword then. You would be blessed and cursed at the same time. So another way of looking at this is through the mind-brain connection. So Roger Sperry once said, "Human decision-making is not indeterminate, but self-determinate. Everyone normally wants to have control over what he does and to determine his own choices in accordance with his own wishes. People may be relatively free from much that goes on around them, but they are not free from their inner selves." So let's proceed with an example. So individuals who suffer from temporal lobe epilepsy are confined to bouts of psychical seizures. All right, so psychical seizures may entail re-experiencing a memory of sorts, rage and hyper-emotionality or emotional dysfunction, hypersociability or social stickiness, which a lot of my friends would describe as having porous interpersonal boundaries, hypersexuality or a loss of sexual desire, hypergraphia, which is basically an excessive, disinhibited and meticulous detail when it comes to written communication, and perhaps a protracted intellectual focus, which can birth creative products, which some people might appraise as historically novel or unique. So their neurocognitive or neuroanatomical wiring decreases their degrees of personal freedom, in that these salient features of their perceptual interface with the cosmos were something of a congenital or an acquired dowry, so it was imposed by nature and never within the locus of their own control. They had as much choice in choosing these aspects of their personality or characterological disposition as a frog has in choosing its skin coloration. As Menander once said, "We live not as we wish to, but as we can." The known proverb, "A leopard never changes its spots," is also a clever allusion to the deterministic phenomenon. So the deterministic position is also supported by lesion studies and what happens to an individual when they are brain damaged. Knowledge of functional brain areas remained pretty proto-scientific and speculative until about the mid-19th century, when a railroad construction foreman by the name of Phineas Gage suffered a horrendous cerebral accident. As he tamped dynamite into blasting holes, the dynamite exploded, sending the tamping rod under his left cheekbone and out through the top of his skull, damaging his frontal lobe. Gage miraculously survived the prefrontal lobotomy, but it impelled or spurred unbecoming changes to his character or personality. The pre-lobotomy Gage was a punctual, courteous, and highly conscientious employee who was a pleasure to be around. In striking contrast, the post-lobotomy Gage was a petulant, brazen, and socially disinhibited individual who swiftly acquired a reputation for uttering profanities, avoiding responsibilities, and meandering about without meaning or purpose. Unbeknownst to his employers, family, friends, and physicians at the time, Gage was unlucky enough to suffer assault to the highly differentiated connections of the prefrontal cortex, an associational area of the brain responsible for the integration of internal and external data over time, the problem-solving and decision-making processes, and the mediation of pro-social behavior and emotions. We attribute many socio-cultural and behavioral variances amid the highest subhuman primates and ourselves to expansion and increased differentiation in these frontal brain areas, and damage to them through trauma, stroke, lesions, neurodegenerative conditions, and whatnot can lead to an immediate cognitive regress, severely hampering our sense of self. What is more is that through specific lesion studies, we've been able to identify correlations between specific brain areas and traits, characteristics, or qualities of the human condition. So, for example, when we have bilateral lesions in the dorsolateral prefrontal areas, or a unilateral lesion to the left dorsolateral prefrontal area, this will manifest in a condition known as a pseudodepression or dorsolateral syndrome, where what we may observe is impaired problem solving, poor organizational strategies, inattention, amotivation, a neglect of personal hygiene, maybe impaired insight and judgment, longer response latencies, perseveration, stimulus-bound behaviors, an inability to think divergently, confabulation, impaired working memory, and so forth. Then, if the lesion were in the orbital frontal prefrontal areas, which is a little bit more lower or inferior to the dorsolateral areas, what we might see is a condition called Witzel-Sucht disease or pseudopsychopathy, where the individual will exhibit behavioral disinhibition, social vulgarity, and poor social skills, inappropriate jocularity, a lack of empathy, irritability, emotional outbursts, agitation, and olfactory deficits, or what is known as anosmia. Then, if the bilateral lesions were in the medial frontal lobes, then we would have a condition known as medial frontal syndrome or akinetic apathetic syndrome manifest, and this is usually characterized by the appearance of apathy, mutism, a lack of interest or indifference, sometimes a leg weakness contralateral to the lesion, social disengagement, indifference, a lack of initiation, emotional underactivity, a blunted affect, incontinence sometimes, particularly both bladder and bowel, and an amnesia with confabulation. So these specific conditions definitely illuminate that free will or non-determinism may in fact be an illusion that is bequeathed to us by natural selection. The secret to unraveling this Gordian knot may depend on scouring the historical annals of experimental psychology, explicitly the ingenious experiments of the neuroscientist Benjamin Libet. Renowned for his groundbreaking work on temporal relations between subjective conscious experiences and their neural underpinnings, Libet inadvertently found himself in dialectical opposition to the conventional philosophical wisdom regarding our perceived freedom, our free will, by discovering that the decision to act is unconsciously determined before we become cognizant of the fact. Just let that percolate for a while. So this counterintuitive and perplexing discovery was made in the following manner. First and foremost, subjects were positioned before a clock with a swiftly rotating spot indicative of time and subsequently commanded to flex their wrists. The subjects were divided into two groups. In one, the movement was supposed to be arbitrary, and in the other, it was pre-planned. To obtain a tangible benchmark for the conscious will to flex, Lebet and his crew requested that participants report the position of the spot at the precise time they decided to recourse to action. Irrespective of whether the movement was pre-planned or capriciously expressed, standardization of the experimental data showed that the conscious decision preceded the actual motor act, so the activation of the neuromuscular system, by about 200 to 150 milliseconds or a fifth of a second. Intracranial electrophysiology, permitting the surveillance of brainwaves before, during, and after the mental event, showed salient neural activity in the supplementary motor cortex 400 to 350 milliseconds, or approximately a third of a second, before the intention to move entered conscious awareness. So that seems strange and perplexing, right? Apparently, the observable neurophysiological events we assume to be connected with a voluntary movement itself, and later in a causal chain where mental events initiate physical ones, precede conscious intent itself. The movement is initiated by brain processes in unconscious fashion, and awareness of the decision itself is but a passive observer, and a latecomer at that. Most struggle with the ascription of conscious will to unconscious processes because it flirts openly with a worldview in which intentionality has no empirical validity, a fiction generated and propagated over time to keep the collective self bathed in the best possible light. Why should anyone believe in a disempowering a thing as human protagonists with life courses circumscribed by the imagination of an ineffable author, puppets on strings, when it's much more satiating and gratifying to think of ourselves as authors of our own meaningful narratives? Who'd want to be like a paramecium, reacting reflexively to changes in water temperature? Lebet may or may not have been sensitive to this matter when he construed the correlated mental and neurophysiological phenomena in favor of free will, albeit a delimited one. And, one would know the manner in which he interpreted these phenomena if you've read his book, Mind Time. So what he actually proposed was that the 150 milliseconds or so separating conscious awareness of the will to act and the motor act itself was sufficient time in which the subject could veto the decision and prevent processes of an unconscious origin from reaching fruition. Since there's no empirical evidence in support of a mandatory role for conscious awareness in the execution of volitional processes or of veto choices being initiated unconsciously, one could interpret the conscious veto as an aspect of a higher order control function in humans, which is not reducible or describable by objective physical events. The conscious veto could in fact be a non-physical regulator of neuronal activity with top-down or causative control of unconscious brain processes. Put differently, and more simply, Lebet is proposing that there is some truth to our perceived freedom or latitude, and that this cannot be couched within a strictly deterministic or reductive account of the cosmos. Benjamin Lebet's experiments into free will are fairly compatible with my research into precognitive dreams or predictive dreams. So these convey authentic knowledge of persons that have not yet entered the life of the sentient observer, or of events that have not yet come to pass. And I describe much of the phenomenology around precognitive dreams and their possible neural underpinnings in my book, A Critical Investigation into Precognitive Dreams, Dreamscaping Without My Timekeeper, which was published last year by Cambridge Scholars Publishing. So on the odd occasion, an outcome suggested by a precognitive dream can be vetoed or subverted. Let me offer an example of this phenomenon from my own repository of experience. One very memorable precognitive dream I had commences in the backyard of a house resembling my own. Somebody had just discovered an alchemical concoction, a white elixir, which I had just finished brewing in the garage and then thrown onto the roof for some unknown reason. In order to retrieve the treasured item, I position a ladder against the chrome-colored wall on the south side of the house and climb up to the edge of the roof. At some point, I remember I am acrophobic, and I'm acrophobic in real life too. I make the terrible mistake of peering down and am nearly overwhelmed by a dizzy spell. Not wanting to climb any higher, I reach up to the terracotta roof shingles and begin searching frantically for the stoppered flask with only my hands as my guide. Without any warning, an excruciating pain shoots up my right arm. I retract my hands and see that I've grazed it against crumbling bits of obsidian. The injury is quite severe. Glass fragments have caused lacerations by wedging themselves into the palm of my hand, causing blood to spurt like a fountain. I'm awoken by my own scream. 2 uneventful days pass before the unfolding of the associated waking event. I remember I was entertaining myself in the backyard by throwing a tennis ball around. It was an energetic activity. It evoked playfulness and happiness on my part. At one stage, I became overexcited and put a little extra oomph behind my pitch, causing the ball to land in the roof gutter. I fetched a ladder from the garage, stood it against the brick wall to the south end of the house, and clambered up to retrieve the lost ball. Wait a second, this feels very familiar, an inner voice erupted from someplace inside me. Suddenly, the disturbing dream came flooding back into conscious awareness, and I realized an identical train of real-world events was in the midst of unraveling. To obstruct the foreshadowed accident, I climbed to a position from where I was able to see the contents of the gutter without having to look down and could retrieve the ball without any mishaps. Scanning the totality of the gutter, I saw the edges were jagged enough to induce deep cuts and abrasions. It appears the real-world counterpart to the dream could not reach its natural culmination point. I became aware of it with ample time to intervene and break the causal chain before the natural sequence of events could produce an undesirable outcome. I chose not to look down. I chose not to simply feel along what was in the gutter when my vision was obstructed. Depending on how you look at it, I altered the trajectory of events by vetoing these actions, or by selecting alternate actions competing for my attention. It was an auspicious moment worthy of awe and deference, one which eludes semantic comprehension. I can only describe it as a transient awakening from a hypnotic stupor, the incarceration of an acute hyper-awareness of how an ordained path being hewn through the cosmic fabric might be gilded for the better. A fortuitous opportunity to load nature's dice so that odd numbers, for example, never come up, and I'm speaking quite metaphorically here. It's an opportunity to spoil cyan so that when we mix it with magenta, it does not create the same shade of blue. Precognitive intrusions or dreams, though, are sporadic visitors in our dreamscapes, and it's impossible to veto the same shades of lamentable blue from appearing on our life canvas when we have no direct knowledge or experience of that shade to begin with. A germane analogy would be asking a child with congenital achromatopsia to stop drawing with cobalt blues and auburn reds, and congenital achromatopsia is a condition whereby we lose the ability to see, remember, or imagine colors. We cannot exert influence on aspects of the cosmos occluded by our cognitive closure. Overall, the precognitive dream phenomenon supports a cosmology where the future is, to a vast degree, predetermined. Also implicit is that the cosmos cannot be causal in an absolute sense. Our ability to thwart precognitive visions from coming to be by consciously aborting one or many of the steps connected with a decision-making process which would have delivered the implied outcome means we can still exercise some degree or level of free will. We can live in the pockets of a paradoxical world, no doubt. So the ground we've covered suggests that certain things, such as our biological constitution and the laws it obeys, are definitely fixed and absolute, but within the trajectory of that delimitation, we may be able to exert small-scale influence and tip the scales in favour of one potential outcome over another. It may be more prudent to subscribe to a soft, reciprocal determinism, a cautious middle ground, in lieu of a regimented either-or position. The following metaphor is apropos in describing this soft determinism. We are all marionettes recapitulating the same circular motions within linear, co-created narratives across an ambient background of fields known as the time-space continuum, the realm of gross matter. On the odd occasion, we peer upwards and become vaguely aware of the prehensile forces to which we are attached with strings, the prodigious gravity of the past, and rarer still do we twitch and acquire the urgent lucidity necessary for the mobilization of internal resources as to encumber an interaction from occurring or an action being carried to completion. Our inclination for indolence means we're swimming against the current and more likely to take the disempowering path of least resistance. Insofar as this is the status quo, our creative or esemplastic power to manipulate the social environment, create openings for opportunity and serendipity, and alter the rapidly converging trajectory of our own lives will be severely circumscribed. When it does occur, though, this minor amendment to the theatrical configuration may have far-reaching consequences for the scene, for the crescendos and diminuendos within particular scenes and acts, and sometimes for the entire play and the nature of its closure. Pushing boulders uphill only to have them roll back down again may not just be a signature trope in classical mythology, but also a powerful ode to the narrative unfolding of a life resistant to volitional control. Sometimes we're successful at diverting the tumultuous roll in another direction, and other times we're not. Small-scale change is rare, but it's also a pregnant possibility. Chances of altering the trajectory and culmination point are always going to be greater earlier on in the process, before the frenetic roll has accrued too much speed and traction. It's both a clever allusion to the time-sensitive periods in maturation of the human nervous system and the systematic development of neurotypical cognitive functioning, and a potent reminder of the importance of early therapeutic intervention in altering the pathophysiology of a disease process and its associated neurobehavioral sequelae. Metaphors, themselves products of the human imagination, are rife with analogy and multiple meaning. Contained within the one just described is a conceptual space for the preservation of human intentionality and free will. In the final analysis, the jettisoning of an old binary system for a more integrated perspective is essential in an evolutionary sense, for it safeguards the judicial system, a governing enterprise predicated upon the legitimacy of volition and self-determination. If people cannot be held accountable for their own actions, there would be no reason to trial anyone, and the glue of social order would disintegrate. In addition, the boundary between right and wrong, the philosophical constructs of good and evil, would become murky, and inevitably chaos and disorder would ensue. Save for its intellectual attractiveness and neutrality, a soft, reciprocal determinism keeps all complacent and preserves order in the kingdom of scientific intelligibility and the world itself. Okay, and last but not least, we have the reference list, alphabetized. On this slide, you'll see references from A to GA. On this slide, we have the reference listings beginning from GO and ending at ME. And on this slide, the remainder of the references beginning with ME and ending with YO.